Restaurant manager feeds truck drivers during snow avalanche. 2 days later, an endless line of large trucks appears. The late afternoon air in Montana carried a sharp, biting chill, the kind that stung the skin even through thick layers of clothing. Above the endless stretch of flatlands and pine-dotted hills, the sky darkened into a menacing steel gray, heavy with the promise of snow. Maggie Turner stood just inside the glass doors of Turner's Diner, arms crossed over her apron, surveying the empty parking lot that was slowly disappearing beneath the first thin layer of white. Inside, the diner hummed with the last quiet clinks of silverware and the soft murmur of conversations winding down. Maggie had decided early that morning to close 3 hours ahead of schedule. The local news stations, every one of them, had been blaring the same warning. A historic blizzard was headed their way, expected to dump over 3 feet of snow in less than 24 hours. She had watched the reports carefully, her stomach knotting tighter with every update. Over her 20 years managing the Turner's Diner, she had seen her fair share of harsh Montana winters, but something in the voice of the weather anchor, an almost tangible unease, made her believe this storm would be different. "All right, folks," she said, raising her voice enough to reach the few lingering customers scattered across the red vinyl booths. "Time to wrap it up. Roads are going to get nasty quick." The regulars grumbled but complied, bundling into their coats and scarves. Maggie moved between tables, offering refills of coffee for the road and plastic bags to carry leftovers. She smiled, joked, and moved with practiced efficiency, hiding the anxiety gnawing at her beneath a well-worn mask of hospitality. Behind the counter, Juan and Tessa, her 2 loyal cooks, packed up the kitchen. Pots clanged against metal countertops, and the smell of disinfectant began to overpower the usual comforting scent of coffee and bacon grease. Maggie caught Juan's eye and gave a small, firm nod. He returned it, understanding immediately, shut it down fast but safe. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the diner was locked up, lights dimmed, the neon Turner's sign flickering against the growing wall of snow. Maggie wiped her hands on her jeans and pulled her parka tighter around her frame before stepping outside to assess the situation. The snow had begun to fall in earnest now, thick and blinding, whipping sideways in furious gusts of wind that howled like a living thing. She squinted toward the highway just beyond the tree line. The interstate usually roared with a never-ending flow of trucks and cars, headlights piercing the dusk. Now, it was eerily silent, the world muffled under the gathering snow. As Maggie turned to go back inside, movement caught her eye. There, barely visible through the blizzard, a convoy of semi-trucks sat idling along the side of the road. Dozens of them, red, blue, green, white, all lined up like a broken chain. Some had hazard lights blinking faintly through the storm. Others just sat still, engines growling low, the drivers nowhere to be seen. A cold knot twisted in her stomach. She knew the road must have been shut down farther ahead, trapping these drivers in place with nowhere to go. Her heart sank further when she realized the diner was the only building within 5 miles offering any semblance of shelter or warmth. She hesitated, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The logical part of her said to lock the doors, go home and wait out the storm. She had already done more than most by staying open late, but another part, deeper and more stubborn, the part that had made her return to Montana after her father's death to keep Turner's alive, refused to walk away so easily. Inside, the coffee machines were still warm. The walk-in freezer was stocked with meats, eggs, bread, and enough canned goods to feed an army. Maggie's mind raced through the inventory, calculating what she had versus what she could spare. "Damn it, Maggie," she muttered under her breath, feeling the first sting of tears threaten her determined expression. The storm howled around her as she made her decision. She pulled her keys from her pocket, unlocked the door and marched back into the diner. Her boots squeaked against the freshly mopped floors as she flipped on the lights one more time. "Juan, Tessa," she called out into the kitchen, voice strong, leaving no room for argument. "The coffee brewing again. We have work to do." Yet she would not let those drivers freeze, not if she could help it. Understood perfectly. I will maintain the minimum of 5,000 characters per part. Avoid any repetition. Stay entirely in English without inserting subtitles or emojis, and strictly follow all your formatting instructions. The snow did not relent. By 7 o'clock in the evening, it was falling in thick, furious sheets, erasing the world beyond the edges of the diner's glowing windows. Inside, Maggie moved quickly, fueled by a sharp sense of urgency and a deep current of worry that refused to leave her chest. She had barely finished brewing 2 fresh pots of coffee when she stepped outside again, bracing against the brutal cold, scanning the desolate stretch of highway once more. What she saw made her blood run colder than the air. The line of trucks had doubled in length. They stretched back beyond what her eyes could track in the storm. Some were tilted at odd angles, where the snowdrifts had begun to swallow their tires. Others sat immobile, engines either killed or running low on fuel to conserve what little they had. Dim figures shuffled near the cabs, bundled so heavily against the cold that they looked more like moving piles of clothing than men. One driver stumbled from his rig toward the diner, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, head bowed against the cutting wind. Maggie rushed to meet him, her boots sinking into the rapidly deepening snow. When he lifted his face, she saw a man in his late 40s, eyes bloodshot and lips cracked from the cold. "Ma'am," he croaked, his voice hoarse, "any place we can warm up for a bit? They closed the interstate, been sitting here over 3 hours already." Maggie nodded without hesitation. "Coffee, food if you need it." "Come inside. Bring anyone else you can get." We have the man's relief was palpable. He turned back toward the line of trucks, waving his arms frantically. More drivers emerged, some hesitant, others practically running across the snowy expanse toward the beacon of light and warmth that was Turner's Diner. Maggie threw open the double doors and ushered them in, the sudden rush of cold air sending a cascade of shivers through the restaurant. Juan and Tessa peered out from the kitchen, their faces a mixture of confusion and understanding. Without waiting for instructions, Tessa began pulling out soup pots and slicing up loaves of bread, while Juan stoked the old wood-burning stove near the corner to provide additional heat. Within minutes, the diner, which had been so still and quiet just a short while before, buzzed with the muffled sounds of boots stomping, coats being shaken out, and low murmurs of gratitude. Maggie moved among the men, directing them toward seats, handing out mugs of steaming coffee with quick, efficient motions. As she worked, she overheard snippets of their stories. Most had been driving for hours when the emergency alerts came through. The highway patrol had blocked off the main exits, forcing them to pull over and wait it out. Several had been low on supplies even before the stoppage. Now, with the storm worsening by the hour, they were trapped without food, warmth, or hope of moving until the weather cleared. The thought of them sitting helplessly in their trucks, freezing and hungry, ignited a fierce resolve in Maggie. She realized this was no temporary inconvenience. This was a life-threatening situation unfolding in real time, and she might be the only person within miles able to do anything about it. She did a rough count as more drivers continued to trickle in. By her estimate, there were at least 40, men already inside and more still coming. She had enough supplies to feed perhaps one good dinner to that many people if she stretched things carefully. Beyond that, she would need to get creative. Determined not to let her worry show, Maggie approached Juan and Tessa behind the counter. "We feed them everything we can spare," she said simply. "Sandwiches, whatever keeps them warm." "Start with the easy stuff. Soups." Juan nodded solemnly. Tessa offered a grim smile and set about ladling out bowls of hearty vegetable soup, the rich aroma cutting through the lingering scent of coal that clung to the newcomers. Maggie grabbed a battered old notepad from under the register and began organizing a rough roster. Names, truck numbers if they had them, notes on anyone who seemed in worse shape than others. It was an old habit from her days of running emergency. Drills with her father, back when Turner's had served as an unofficial shelter during the occasional flood or wildfire. As she moved from table to table, taking down names, offering smiles and words of comfort, Maggie could see the gratitude etched into every tired, weather-beaten face. These were men used to hard work and harsh conditions, but even the toughest among them were vulnerable tonight. Outside, the storm raged with growing ferocity. The walls of the diner shuddered under the assault of the wind, and the parking lot disappeared entirely under a smooth, undulating blanket of white. The trucks that had not yet made it to the diner were being consumed by the storm, their headlights barely visible now, faint halos swallowed by the swirling blizzard. From the corner of her eye, Maggie noticed a young man slumped over in a booth near the window, his body trembling violently. She rushed over, pressing the back of her hand to his forehead. He was burning up, feverish. "Tessa," she called sharply, "blankets, now!" Within moments, several drivers were helping to bundle the young man in thick layers. Maggie instructed them to move him closer to the wood stove, praying that warmth and hydration would be enough until proper medical help could be summoned. But deep down, she knew that with the roads closed and emergency services overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the storm, they were on their own for the foreseeable future. The hours blurred together as Maggie, Juan, Tessa, and even some of the less exhausted truckers worked side by side to keep everyone fed and warm. They brewed endless pots of coffee, fried up eggs and bacon when the soup ran low, and handed out every last slice of bread they could spare. By midnight, every booth and stool was occupied, with drivers huddled together under borrowed blankets, sharing stories and quietly offering thanks for the unexpected sanctuary they had found. And outside, the storm showed no signs of stopping. "Understood perfectly. I will maintain the 5,000 character minimum, avoid any repetition, keep the narrative in English without inserting any subtitles or emojis, and strictly follow all instructions." The clock above the counter ticked past 1 o'clock in the morning, its steady movement at odds with the chaos and exhaustion filling Turner's diner. Maggie leaned against the counter for a brief moment, rubbing her temples with the tips of her fingers, feeling the pressure of the day settle deep into her bones. She allowed herself only a few seconds to gather strength before pushing away from the counter and returning to work. There was no time to indulge in fatigue, not when so many people were depending on her. The storm outside had grown even worse. Snow battered the windows in relentless sheets, driven sideways by howling gusts of wind. The world beyond the diner's warm walls no longer existed, swallowed by a relentless white void. It was as if the diner itself had become an island adrift in an endless frozen ocean. Inside, every chair, booth, and empty space had been filled. Some of the drivers had managed to grab brief moments of sleep, curled up in their coats with heads resting on the counters. Others sat in quiet clusters, drinking coffee, sharing stories, or simply staring out at the impenetrable night, knowing they were stranded and powerless against the wrath of nature. Maggie did a quick inventory of their remaining supplies. The three shelves behind the kitchen were looking dangerously bare. Half a dozen cans of soup, 2 loaves of bread, a crate of potatoes, and a few odds and ends that would not last through another meal. She chewed her lip, debating her next move. There was a strong temptation to ration strictly, to hoard what little they had and stretch it out for as long as possible. But looking around at the exhausted, freezing men slumped in every corner of the diner, she knew she could not bring herself to let them go hungry. These drivers were strangers, yet they were also her responsibility now. They had come to her doorstep, and she had opened it. That bond, unspoken and sacred, meant everything. In this moment, it was a decision made not from logic, but from something older, deeper, an instinct that had been carved into her heart long before tonight, during years of watching her parents open their doors to anyone in need, no questions asked. "Juan, Tessa," she called out, her voice steady even though she felt anything but calm. "Walk in open. Everything we have left, we use it." Get the Juan shot her a look of concern but did not argue. He understood. They all did. The diner had always been more than just a place to grab a meal. It had been a refuge, a lifeline, a home for those who had none. Tonight, that legacy mattered more than ever. Maggie tied her apron tighter around her waist and grabbed a stack of mixing bowls. If they were going to feed everyone again, they would need to get creative. She pulled out flour, sugar, yeast, everything they could, scrounge up, and set to work making simple bread rolls enough to fill stomachs and provide warmth against the cold. Juan manned the griddle, frying up whatever meat they had left, while Tessa crafted massive pots of potato soup, throwing in bits of leftover vegetables and broth to stretch the ingredients as far as they could go. The kitchen became a frenzied, beautiful dance of movement and collaboration. Drivers who had caught a second wind volunteered to chop vegetables, scrub pans, or sweep the ever-growing slush puddles from the entrance. Nobody sat idle. Maggie moved among them like a general on a battlefield, giving orders, checking on the sick, handing out hot food with a smile she hoped masked her growing worry. Somewhere in the midst of the controlled chaos, an older driver named Hank approached. Maggie at the counter. His hands were rough, his face lined with decades of hard work and harsh weather. He removed his cap respectfully before speaking. "You did not have to do this, you know," he said, voice low and steady. "Locked their doors and left us to fend for ourselves." A lot of folks would have Maggie smiled faintly, feeling the weight of those words settle over her like another blanket. "My father always said you cannot call yourself part of a town if you turn your back when people need you most," she answered. "Besides, it is just food. If it helps someone get through the night, then it is worth every can and every crumb." Hank nodded, his eyes glistening slightly in the dim light. He reached out and pressed something into her hand, a battered silver coin, worn smooth from years of handling. "Lucky token," he said simply. "Could use it more than me tonight. Brought me home safe more times than I can count. Reckon you." Before she could protest, he turned and shuffled back to his booth, leaving Maggie standing there, the coin warm from his hand, a tiny spark of hope in the encroaching darkness. The night stretched on, each hour blending into the next. Maggie lost track of how many bowls of soup they served, how many pots of coffee they brewed. Fatigue gnawed at her muscles, but adrenaline and determination kept her moving. She checked on the young man with the fever every half hour, adjusting, his blankets coaxing small sips of broth into him. His condition had not worsened, but neither had it improved. In the small moments between tasks, she listened to the low hum of conversation around the diner. Men who had been strangers just hours earlier now spoke like old friends, bonded by hardship and the simple miracle of survival. They swapped stories about the worst storms they had ever driven through, about families waiting for them hundreds of miles away, about the jobs they loved and hated in equal measure. Maggie realized that something remarkable was happening here, something bigger than just feeding hungry men. In the face of overwhelming cold and isolation, humanity was blooming anew, fragile and fierce. She glanced toward the windows where the blizzard continued its furious assault on the diner. They were still trapped, and tomorrow would bring new challenges. Supplies would run out, tempers might fray, desperation could set in. But for tonight, at least, they were together. And Maggie would do whatever it took to keep them safe. One meal, one moment, one heartbeat at a time. Dawn did not so much break. As seep reluctantly into the world, a dim gray light struggling through the heavy veil of clouds and swirling snow. Inside Turner's diner, the atmosphere was thick with the sour, sweet blend of exhaustion, sweat, coffee, and hope. Maggie stood at the kitchen pass-through, her sleeves rolled up, her hands red and raw from hours of non-stop work, staring at the depleted shelves and the empty bins. They were running out of food, not just low, out. The realization hit her like a physical blow. In the haze of cooking, serving, and managing the growing crowd of stranded truckers, she had pushed the thought aside. But now there was no avoiding it. They had perhaps enough supplies left to serve one more meal, if they scraped every bit of resourcefulness they had left. Juan wiped the back of his hand across his forehead, his face etched with fatigue. Tessa leaned against the wall, her apron stained with soup and grease, her body sagging with exhaustion. They had done more than Maggie could ever ask, but they were nearing the limits of their endurance. "We are about out of everything," Juan said hoarsely, confirming what Maggie already knew. "Flour, beans, coffee grounds, even the butter is gone." Maggie nodded slowly, thinking. There were still more drivers arriving from the highway, word spreading that the diner was open, a beacon in the blizzard. Every newcomer brought more hope, but also more mouths to feed. She pressed her hands flat against the cool countertop, grounding herself. Giving up was not an option. These men had nowhere else to go. Even if all they could offer was shelter and warmth, that was something. And Maggie knew that people could survive hunger longer than they could survive freezing to death. "We keep the coffee going," she said finally. "Anyone sick or weak? We ration what little food we have left." Priority to Juan and Tessa nodded without hesitation. Even exhausted, they trusted her judgment. The first obstacle, however, was not merely the dwindling supplies. It was what came next, the slow, creeping realization among the truckers that food was nearly gone. Tension, once held at bay by full bellies and the comforting routine of meals, began to creep into the atmosphere like smoke under a door. Maggie saw it in the furtive glances exchanged over mugs of weak coffee, in the way conversations grew quieter and sharper at the edges. People began to count plates, to notice second helpings, to guard their scraps a little more jealously. She had to act before fear and resentment turned the diner from a sanctuary into a powder keg. Gathering every ounce of authority she had honed over years of running Turner's, Maggie climbed onto the counter, signaling for attention. The conversations faded into silence, dozens of tired, wary faces turning toward her. "I am not going. To lie to you," she began, her voice steady and clear. "Food. What we have left will not feed everyone a full meal again. And we are running low." On a ripple of unease passed through the room, but she held up her hand. "But we have warmth, we have shelter, we have coffee, and most importantly, we have each other. If we stick together, if we watch out for one another, we will get through this. Help is coming, the roads will clear. This storm will not last forever." The silence stretched for a moment longer, heavy with uncertainty. Then Hank, the older driver who had given her the lucky coin, stood and clapped his hands together. "You heard the lady," he said. "We are truckers. We have sat through worse at loading docks. We can handle a little empty stomach if it means getting home." A few men chuckled, the tension easing a fraction. Slowly others followed, offering nods, murmured agreements. Maggie stepped down from the counter, feeling a swell of gratitude and pride that threatened to break her carefully controlled composure. In the hours that followed, a new rhythm emerged. Maggie, Juan, Tessa, and a rotating crew of volunteers worked to stretch the final supplies into something resembling meals. Tessa crafted a thick stew from the last of the potatoes and canned vegetables. Juan baked flatbreads over the griddle, using the last remnants of flour and water. It was not glamorous, but it was food. Drivers took turns manning the coffee station, making sure the weak brew kept flowing. Blankets were redistributed to those who needed them most. They formed shifts for resting, ensuring that the sick and the elderly had the best spots near the wood stove. Some drivers even rigged up makeshift insulation by taping spare coats and sleeping bags over the windows and door frames to keep the heat inside. There were moments when tempers flared, a harsh word over a spilled mug, a sharp glance at someone taking an extra slice of bread, but they were fleeting, quickly extinguished by the collective determination to survive without turning on each other. Late in the afternoon, when the storm showed no signs of easing, a young driver named Peter approached Maggie with a battered old radio in his hands. "Got this working off my truck battery," he said. "Know we are here. Maybe we can catch a signal." Let someone. Maggie's heart lifted at the thought. Communication with the outside world had been severed when the storm knocked out power and cell towers the day before. If they could reach someone, anyone, it would make all the difference. They rigged up the radio near the front counter, the static crackling through the diner like a lifeline thrown across a stormy sea. Peter hunched over the dials, tuning carefully, his fingers trembling with cold and anticipation. For a long while there was nothing but the hiss of empty air. Then faintly a voice emerged, thin and warbling, barely discernible. "This is emergency broadcast. Highway closed from mile marker 87 to 150. Shelters overwhelmed. Remain in place. Rescue operations delayed." The words cut through the room like a blade. Rescue was coming, but not soon. They were truly on their own for at least another day, maybe longer. Maggie felt the weight of it settle over her shoulders. But she also saw the flicker of resilience in the faces around her. They had survived the first night. They had faced the first obstacle of dwindling supplies. They could face what came next, together. As the second night fell over Montana, the storm remained an unrelenting force, pounding the diner's windows with icy fists and burying the world deeper under a crushing weight of snow. Inside Turner's diner, the atmosphere was subdued, but not broken. The truck drivers huddled together, wrapped in layers of blankets and coats, speaking in low murmurs or resting in uneasy sleep. Maggie moved quietly among them, checking on the sick, refilling mugs with the thinnest coffee she had ever served, offering a steady presence amid the storm's chaos. Despite the exhaustion pulling at her body like an anchor, Maggie's spirit refused to yield. She noticed the subtle changes taking root in the diner. A different kind of survival, one that ran deeper than food or fire. It was the slow, steady flowering of silent gratitude. It started with small gestures. One of the drivers, a heavy-set man named Bill, spent an hour tightening the screws on the front door hinges, reinforcing them against the howling wind. He said nothing, merely nodded at Maggie when she thanked him. Another group, led by Peter with the old radio, took it upon themselves to clear the snow from around the diner's perimeter, carving narrow paths so the weight would not cause the building to collapse under pressure. They fashioned makeshift shovels from baking trays and broken chair legs, laboring wordlessly against the blizzard. Others contributed in their own ways. Someone repaired the loose wiring that powered the diner's backup lights. Someone else reinforced the wood stove with additional firewood scavenged from the cargo of a nearby stranded truck. Every act was done without expectation of reward, without fanfare, often without words. In a world reduced to survival, gratitude did not need to be spoken. It lived in the doing. Maggie noticed that even the younger, more restless drivers, the ones who had first shown signs of impatience, were falling into line following the quiet example set by the older veterans. They took turns keeping watch through the windows, scanning for signs of rescuers, offering reassurance with a simple glance or a squeeze on the shoulder. Late into the evening, as Maggie leaned against the counter, watching her impromptu community work in exhausted unison, she felt a tap on her arm. It was Joe Randall, a wiry man with a thick beard and a mischievous glint that even the blizzard could not dim. He held up a battered old CB radio mic. "Been broadcasting," he said with a grin. "Guess it is better than sitting around worrying. Right? Telling the other truckers what you're doing here?" Maggie smiled, too tired to form a proper reply, but warmed by the thought. Joe's broadcasts might reach more drivers, might bring hope to others stranded out there in the white abyss. She nodded her encouragement, and Joe returned to his makeshift station near the windows, his voice crackling into the frozen night, a beacon in the darkness. The gratitude continued in other small but powerful ways. When Maggie passed out what little food remained, a few scraps of stew, thin pieces of bread, it was received with solemn nods, no complaints, no grumbles. Men who spent their lives chasing tight schedules and battling traffic jams now sat side by side, sharing what little they had without argument. They offered pieces of their meager meals to those who looked weaker, passed their blankets to the elderly without being asked. As midnight approached, Maggie sat for the first time in nearly 2 days, sinking onto a booth seat near the window. The snow pressed hard against the glass, a solid wall of white that reflected the soft, flickering light inside. Across the room, Juan and Tessa worked in exhausted synchronization, cleaning pots, wiping counters, preparing for whatever new challenges tomorrow would bring. The young man who had been feverish earlier stirred from his sleep, his eyes fluttering open. Maggie was at his side immediately, her hand on his forehead. He was cooler now, the fever breaking. His lips cracked into a faint smile. "Thanks. He whispered hoarsely. Maggie smiled back, brushing his hair away from his forehead. She said nothing, but her heart swelled with relief. Every small victory mattered in a night like this. In the silence that followed, Maggie allowed herself to think about the world beyond the storm, about the families waiting for these men, worrying, hoping, about the way the news would probably forget this small miracle of human kindness tucked away in a snow-buried diner no one had ever heard of. And yet for the people inside these walls, it would be a memory etched in their bones forever, a testament to what it meant to endure, to care, to share. Sometime in the early morning hours, when the blizzard outside began to ease from furious rage into a steady, tired snowfall, Maggie found herself staring at the battered silver coin Hank had given her. She turned it over and over in her palm, its edges worn smooth by countless journeys, countless hands. A lucky token, he had called it, but Maggie realized that luck had very little to do with what was happening here. It was not luck that had kept them alive this long. It was not luck that had transformed a room full of strangers into a brotherhood bound by silent gratitude. It was something far more rare and precious, a stubborn, unyielding belief in the simple dignity of helping one another no matter the cost. The diner grew quieter as more drivers drifted into uneasy sleep. Maggie watched them for a long time, her heart heavy with exhaustion but light with pride. They had survived another night. Tomorrow would bring new battles. Hunger, cold, the gnawing uncertainty of rescue. But tonight they had each other. And that, Maggie knew, was more powerful than any storm. The morning that followed was different, not brighter. The storm still brooded over the land with grim determination, but quieter. The blizzard's violence had lessened to a persistent, heavy fall of snow, and for the first time in days the sky hinted at a softer grey rather than a churning black. Inside Turner's diner, the low buzz of conversations resumed as men stirred awake, groaning and stretching stiff limbs, shaking the frost from their jackets and boots. Maggie walked through the diner with a coffee pot in each hand, pouring into mugs with mechanical efficiency. Her body ached in places she had never realized could hurt before, and her mind swam with fatigue, but she kept moving. It was the only thing she knew to do. Movement kept doubt and fear at bay. It kept hope alive. She reached Joe Randall, who was hunched over the battered CB radio set up near the entrance, his face intense with concentration. He had been broadcasting through the night, sending out updates about their situation and listening for any word in return. Most of it had been static, the occasional garbled reply from other truckers caught in the storm, but nothing concrete. Still, Joe's persistence was unshaken. As Maggie refilled his mug, he looked up at her, his expression different than it had been before. Tense, but also electrified with a strange kind of energy. "You're gonna want to hear this," he said, voice low. Maggie set the coffee pot down, leaning closer. Joe fiddled with the tuner until the static cleared slightly. A rough, tired voice broke through. "Turner's Diner, heard your call. Now word's spread. Truckers are talking. Folks out there know what you did." Maggie's heart skipped a beat. She opened her mouth to ask what he meant, but Joe waved for silence, adjusting the volume. "More trucks coming your way soon as the road's clear. Supplies help. People ain't gonna forget this." The transmission faded back into static. Joe sat back with a grin that split his weathered face. "You got yourself famous, ma'am. Word's gone down the line. Every trucker with a radio knows about you now." Maggie blinked, stunned. She had not thought beyond surviving the next few hours, the next day. The idea that her small act of opening the doors had traveled beyond these snow-covered fields seemed surreal, almost impossible. She leaned heavily against the counter, trying to absorb the weight of it. Joe clapped her on the back with a chuckle. "You saved our hides. Truckers do not forget stuff like that." The day continued slowly, measured in cups of coffee and the soft murmur of conversations. A strange, fragile hope began to bloom among the drivers. Not the desperate hope of survival, but something sturdier, something anchored in the belief that rescue was not just possible, it was coming. The radio continued to buzz throughout the day, faint transmissions weaving in and out. Reports of plows attempting to clear the interstate, volunteer groups coordinating supply drops, even whispers of truckers organizing convoys once the roads were passable to bring aid. It was a tapestry of humanity stitching itself together across the frozen landscape. Maggie moved through it all in a daze. She listened to each message, accepted each handshake, refilled each mug, but inside her mind churned with disbelief. She had never set out to be a symbol of anything. She had simply done what she thought was right. Yet somehow that had resonated farther than she could see. Juan approached her late in the afternoon, wiping his hands on a rag. "We are almost out of coffee grounds," he said. "Maybe enough for one more brew." Maggie nodded, not even surprised. It had become almost routine to face dwindling resources. They would make do. They had made it this far. In the far corner near the stove, Tessa gathered the sick and the weakest of the drivers, coaxing them to sip broth she had conjured from the last bits of canned stock. The young man with the fever, now recovering steadily, gave Maggie a weak thumbs up from across the room. She smiled back, a lump rising in her throat. As dusk settled once more, painting the windows with faint shades of blue and grey, the drivers began gathering together in small groups, sharing plans for when the storm finally broke. They spoke of fixing their rigs, hauling supplies, finding ways to help those still stranded farther down the line. No one spoke of leaving immediately. The bond that had formed within these walls was not something easily abandoned. That evening, Joe once again manned the radio. The crackling voices on the other end grew stronger, more confident. Road crews making progress, few miles at a time, might reach you by tomorrow. And then, from another trucker farther, down the highway. Convoy forming up, bringing supplies. Got word about Turner's. We are coming. Maggie listened, the words sinking deep into her heart. They were coming. Not just rescue teams or government workers, but truckers like the men and women stranded here. Her people answering a call not from duty but from gratitude. She stood at the window long after the others had gone back to sleep, staring out at the faint outline of trucks buried in snow, their forms softened and rounded like ancient stones in the fading light. She thought about her father, about the diner he had built with calloused hands and a stubborn heart. He had always believed that kindness was not a currency to be hoarded, but a flame to be shared, passed from hand to hand until it illuminated the darkest nights. Now, watching the first faint headlights flicker on the farthest curve of the invisible road, Maggie understood just how right he had been. They had weathered the storm together, and soon help would arrive not from obligation or orders, but from the simple, powerful force of a gratitude that needed no words. By the time the first cracks of sunlight broke through the stubborn mass of clouds over Montana, the landscape had transformed. Where once there had been a furious, suffocating blizzard, now there lay an endless stretch of glittering white. The Paini world looked frozen in time, a vast untouched sea of snow reaching to every horizon, broken only by the dark skeletons of stranded trucks and the stubborn silhouette of Turner's diner. Inside, life stirred cautiously. The drivers awoke to a different kind of silence, one not filled with dread but with the cautious hope of change. Maggie rose from her cramped sleeping spot behind the counter, stretching aching limbs that protested every movement. Her joints creaked like old wood as she forced herself upright and blinked into the dim morning light. It was quiet, achingly so, and that quiet told her the storm had finally exhausted itself. She moved slowly through the diner, stepping over sleeping forms, her heart heavy and light at once. The walls bore the marks of the ordeal they had weathered together. Cracked windows patched with duct tape and sleeping bags, scuffed floors, where snow and mud had been tracked in, despite all efforts to keep them clean. The lingering smell of wood smoke and stale coffee. At the far end of the room, Juan and Tessa stirred as well, their faces pale but determined. Without speaking, the three of them moved into a familiar, well-worn rhythm, setting up makeshift breakfasts from the last reserves of supplies. It was barely more than hot water and the dregs of powdered soup, but no one complained. This morning, even the thinnest broth tasted like a feast. Around mid-morning, the first engine rumbles began to echo faintly across the frozen landscape. Maggie froze with a cup of coffee halfway to her lips, her breath catching. Every head in the diner lifted, every face turning toward the sound with an identical expression of disbelief. There it was again, a low, steady growl of diesel engines growing louder, closer. Maggie dropped the cup into the sink and ran to the door, wrenching it open with a grunt of effort. A wall of bright white light blinded her momentarily, but as her eyes adjusted, she saw them. The trucks, a convoy stretching along the interstate like a steel river. Big rigs, supply trucks, utility vehicles, all crawling cautiously through the thick snowbanks, moving like a determined, unstoppable force. The drivers behind her spilled out of the diner, whooping and shouting in disbelief, pounding one another. On the back, pointing and laughing through tears they were too exhausted to wipe away. The convoy was coming for them. Maggie could hardly breathe. She watched as the first trucks reached the edge of the parking lot, headlights cutting through the icy morning air. The vehicles bore signs hastily taped to their sides. "For Turner's heroes, we got you, no one left behind." One by one, the trucks pulled in, engines rumbling, doors swinging open as men and women jumped down into the knee-deep snow. They moved with purpose, carrying crates of food, generators, blankets, medical supplies. Some carried tools and shovels, immediately beginning the work of clearing the parking lot and the paths to the stranded rigs. Maggie stumbled back a step, overwhelmed. She felt a strong hand grip her shoulder and turned to see Joe Randall, grinning like a man who had just seen a miracle. "I told you they were coming," he said. Tears burned her eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to let emotion paralyze her now. She shoved her sleeves up higher, squared her shoulders, and moved forward to meet the newcomers, barking orders, with the same fierce energy that had kept the diner alive through the storm. Within minutes, the frozen silence was replaced by the organized chaos of recovery. Supply crates were hauled inside, generators were hooked up to restore proper lighting and heat, food was distributed. Volunteer medics checked on the sick and injured. Mechanics with toolboxes strapped to their backs began inspecting the trucks buried in snow, making notes, starting engines where possible. The drivers who had weathered the storm at Turner's threw themselves into the work with the same grit that had carried them through the worst of the blizzard. Maggie watched them move, a living testament to endurance, resilience, and a brotherhood forged not in words but in action. By late afternoon, the parking lot was almost entirely cleared. Maggie stood at the edge of the diner, looking out over the scene. Everywhere she looked, there was movement, purpose, life returning to a place that had seemed lost just a day before. A man in a crisp navy jacket approached her, a clipboard in hand. "You Maggie Turner?" he asked. She nodded, bracing herself. The man grinned. "Name's Don Hill. I run Hill Logistics out of Billings. Heard about what you did, couldn't sit at home and do nothing. Figured we could help out a little." Maggie shook his hand, still stunned by the magnitude of what was unfolding. Don continued. "Word spread farther than you know. Truckers all over the state are organizing. Some from Wyoming, the Dakotas, even farther out. You are going to be seeing a lot more help coming your way." Maggie could only nod, her throat too tight with emotion to trust her voice. By nightfall, the diner no longer resembled the desperate shelter it had been. It buzzed with light and warmth, filled with the smell of real food cooking again. The clatter of utensils, the laughter of men and women who had faced the worst and come through stronger. Later that night, as the new arrivals bedded down alongside the storm's survivors, Maggie stood at the window, looking out over the snowy field where the convoy trucks now sat in orderly rows. The snow was melting, slowly, quietly, under the combined heat of engines and bodies and hearts too stubborn to give in to despair. And in that melting, Maggie saw not just the end of a storm, but the beginning of something bigger, a promise that what had been built inside these walls, this fragile, fierce community, would not be buried or forgotten. The storm had tested them, but it had not broken them. They had faced it together, and together they would rise. The world outside Turner's diner began to shift from a landscape of isolation to one of movement. The silence that had blanketed the region for days was broken by the steady hum of engines, the metallic clatter of chains against tires, and the rhythmic scrape of snowplows fighting to carve paths through the frozen wasteland. Every sound felt like a promise, a tangible thread pulling them back toward normalcy. Maggie stood in the doorway of the diner, her arms crossed against the biting air, watching the slow procession of trucks and machinery. Volunteers, rescuers, and drivers from across the state moved in careful unison, clearing the way inch by inch. The world was still muted by the heavy snowfall, but life was pushing through it with steady determination. Inside, the diner buzzed with a different energy. Drivers and volunteers gathered around the freshly stocked tables, sharing meals, coffee, and plans. Conversations no longer revolved solely around survival. They spoke of repairs, of routes reopening, of deliveries delayed but not forgotten. The storm had battered them, but it had not claimed their spirit. As the day wore on, the sounds from the road grew louder, closer. At first it was just a low, distant murmur, barely distinguishable from the ever-present wind. But as the minutes passed, the noise built steadily, a deep, thrumming vibration that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Maggie frowned, stepping farther onto the porch to listen. The drivers inside noticed too, falling silent one by one, turning their heads toward the sound. It was not just the normal rumble of engines struggling through snowdrifts. It was something larger, more deliberate, The vibration grew until it rattled the diner's windows and sent ripples through the crusted snow. Heads poked out from truck cabs and the edges of the building. Men and women gathered near the doors, squinting against the blinding brightness of the snow-covered landscape, searching for the source. Then over the distant ridge they appeared. At first it was a line of dark shapes against the brilliant white, too far to distinguish clearly. But as they drew closer, the shapes resolved into dozens, no hundreds of trucks. Semi-trailers, flatbeds, tankers, and heavy-duty rigs of every color and configuration, their cabs gleaming under the rare, tentative sunlight. They rolled forward slowly but relentlessly, engines growling in unison, a living river of steel and determination stretching back farther than the eye could see. Maggie's mouth fell open slightly as the sight unfolded before her. Around her, the gathered drivers stood rooted in place, stunned into silence by the impossible spectacle. The trucks bore banners made from tarps and spray paint, flapping in the breeze. Turners strong. Thank you, Maggie. Truckers never forget. Horns began to blare, a discordant, beautiful symphony that echoed off the surrounding hills and filled the frozen air with deafening sound. It was not just a convoy. It was a procession, a tribute, an act of collective gratitude rendered in diesel fumes and roaring engines. Tears pricked Maggie's eyes, and this time she did not fight them. She let them fall hot against her frozen cheeks as truck after truck pulled into the clearing around the diner. Drivers stepped down from their cabs, boots crunching against the hard-packed snow. Some carried supplies, others simply extended their hands for firm, wordless shakes, their eyes saying what their voices could not. The scene was almost too much to absorb. Men and women from states Maggie could not even name at the moment had come, drawn not by duty or orders, but by the powerful bond of shared experience and the invisible, unbreakable network that connected them all. They came bearing more than supplies. They came with offers to repair the stranded trucks still buried under the snow, to deliver medical aid to the sick, to help rebuild what had been broken. They came with news, with hope, with laughter that rang out across the frozen ground like a battle cry against the long night they had survived. Maggie moved among them in a daze, accepting handshakes, hugs, even awkward salutes. She did not recognize most of the faces, but it did not matter. They knew her, or at least they knew what she had done. That connection transcended names and places. It was deeper than geography. As the trucks continued to pour in, the clearing around Turner's transformed into a bustling, chaotic encampment. Food trucks appeared, offering steaming plates of hot meals. Portable heaters were set up. Makeshift repair stations sprang into existence beside the road. The air was filled with shouted instructions, laughter, and the rhythmic pounding of tools against metal. At the heart of it all stood Maggie, overwhelmed but resolute, the quiet center of a storm of gratitude. By late afternoon, the line of trucks stretched so far back that it disappeared over the horizon. More were arriving by the hour, their drivers determined to pay their respects in person, to leave behind something tangible in thanks for the kindness they had heard about over the airwaves. Joe Randall approached Maggie sometime before sunset, a broad smile lighting up his weathered face. "Never seen anything like it," he said, voice thick with emotion. "Turner's now." "Whole country's talking about." Maggie shook her head in disbelief. "I just opened the door," she murmured. Joe chuckled. "Yeah, but you kept it open." As the last rays of sunlight stretched long across the snowfields, the sounds from the road, the steady rumble of engines, the occasional blare of a horn, the shouted greetings, became the new heartbeat of Turner's diner. It was no longer a forgotten outpost buried in snow. It had become a symbol, a rallying point, a beacon for everyone who believed that even in the worst storms, kindness could prevail. Maggie stood on the steps of the diner long after night had fallen, watching the endless parade of headlights stretching away into the darkness. Somewhere beyond that horizon, the rest of the world waited. Deliveries delayed, schedules disrupted, lives temporarily put on hold. But here, in this small, snowbound clearing, something infinitely more important had taken root, and it was only just beginning. Would you like me to proceed? Part 9. A massive thank you. As night deepened and the stars began to prick the inky sky, The scene around Turner's diner grew almost surreal. It was as if the small, humble diner had become the center of a vast beating heart, drawing life from every direction. Engines rumbled in the cold air, headlights glowed in long lines across the snowy horizon, and the sound of laughter and conversation spilled from every corner of the encampment. The trucks kept coming, filling every available space, parking along the road, across fields, wherever the snow had been beaten down enough to allow passage. Drivers, bundled against the bitter cold, gathered in tight groups, sharing food, sharing stories, and sharing their reason for being there. They had all heard about Maggie Turner and her diner that had refused to close its doors. They had heard about the stranded truckers who had been fed, warmed, and cared for without hesitation, and they had come to offer thanks in the only way they knew how: by showing up. Maggie moved among them quietly, accepting handshakes and nods with humble grace. She felt like an imposter at her own celebration. Every time someone grabbed her hand or clapped her on the back, she smiled and said thank you. But inside, she wrestled with disbelief. She had not done anything special, at least not by her own standards. She had simply seen people in need and responded. That was what her father had taught her. That was what Turner's Diner had always stood for. Yet here they were, truckers from across the country, filling the frozen fields with their rigs and their gratitude. They came bearing more than their thanks. Many had brought supplies, cases of canned food, bottled water, blankets, batteries, fuel. Others had come ready to work, to repair the diner's battered infrastructure, to dig out stranded trucks, to ensure that the small outpost not only survived, but thrived after the storm. Maggie stood by the front window, watching as a group of drivers set up a massive grill outside. The smell of sizzling meat filled the air, rich and warm, a stark contrast to the cold that still clung to the ground. Tables were erected hastily from planks and sawhorses, and soon a makeshift feast took shape. Hot meals were served without ceremony, paper plates laden with steaming food passed from hand to hand. The drivers gathered in clusters around makeshift fire pits, laughing, swapping stories, and celebrating not just their survival, but the bond that had formed in the heart of a storm. There was no need for speeches, no formal declarations. Their presence was the only testimony necessary. At some point in the evening, Don Hill, the logistics company owner who had helped organize much of the convoy, found Maggie sitting on the porch steps, sipping a cup of lukewarm coffee and watching the fires burn against the snow. "You ought to know," he said, lowering himself carefully to sit beside her. "Thing people forget. This ain't the kind of—" Maggie shrugged, uncomfortable under the weight of so much attention. "I just did what anyone would have done," she said. Don shook his head. "No, ma'am, most folks would have locked the doors, waited for the storm to pass, kept themselves safe. You did not. You opened your doors. You emptied your shelves. You fed strangers with no guarantee anyone was coming to help you. That's the kind of thing people remember. That's the kind of thing that changes people." Maggie stared into why. The distance, the words settling heavy on her heart. She thought of her father again, of the lessons he had woven into the fabric of her upbringing. Kindness without expectation, service without reward. She had never considered it extraordinary. It had always simply been the right thing to do. Now, looking out at the endless rows of trucks and the hundreds of people who had come because of a single act of compassion, she began to understand the depth of what had happened. It was not about the meals or the coffee or even the shelter. It was about the statement that no one would be left alone in the storm. That community could exist even among strangers when one person chose to lead with their heart. Throughout the night, the celebrations continued. Musicians among the drivers pulled out guitars and harmonicas, filling the air with rough but heartfelt music. People danced in the snow, boots kicking up loose powder, cheeks flushed with cold and joy. Children from nearby towns, drawn by the gathering, ran laughing through the crowds, their energy infectious. And always at the center of it all was Maggie, moving from group to group, her presence a grounding force amid the chaos. She accepted their thanks, not because she sought it, but because she understood now that gratitude, like kindness, needed to be received as well as given. As the fires burned low and the first hint of dawn touched the horizon with a pale, icy glow, The scene around the diner began to settle into a contented quiet. The worst was over. Recovery was underway, and the bond forged in the blizzard would not be forgotten. Maggie remained on the porch, wrapped in a thick blanket someone had thrown over her shoulders, watching the stars fade against the growing light. Her body was exhausted beyond measure, but her heart was full in a way she had never known. Turner's Diner would never be the same after this. Neither would she. And somehow, deep in her bones, she knew that was exactly as it should be. The days following the convoy's arrival unfolded with a momentum that Maggie Turner could not have predicted, even in her wildest dreams. What had begun as a desperate act of compassion had exploded into something far greater, something that no amount of preparation or planning could have contained. The trucks kept arriving, the drivers kept coming, and with them, the weight of their gratitude grew heavier than any burden she had ever carried. Maggie had imagined that once the immediate crisis passed, life would slowly return to normal. She had thought that once the snow melted and the roads cleared, the drivers would move on. The supplies would be distributed, and Turner's Diner would quietly resume its modest existence. But gratitude, she learned quickly, was not so easily satisfied. It demanded its own kind of stewardship. Each day brought new arrivals, new donations, and new offers of assistance. Crates of food, cleaning supplies, building materials, and even new kitchen equipment began to pile up around the diner. At first, Maggie welcomed the help. The old building needed repairs, the pantry shelves needed restocking, and the stranded trucks required attention. But it soon became clear that the situation was spiraling beyond simple aid. People wanted to repay her kindness, but not in small ways. Trucking companies offered to finance renovations. A construction crew volunteered to build an entirely new wing for the diner. Several truckers suggested installing a permanent shelter on the property for future emergencies. Others talked of setting up a trust fund in Maggie's name to ensure that Turner's Diner would never again face a shortage of supplies. The scope of it overwhelmed her. Maggie stood in the middle of the chaos, watching teams of volunteers hammering nails, stacking lumber, unloading boxes of brand new furniture, and she felt a deep, almost panicked resistance swelling in her chest. Turner's had always been a humble place, a simple refuge built on the ideals of hard work and quiet service. She had never wanted it to become a monument to herself. One afternoon, as the sun finally began to melt the last stubborn patches of ice from the lot, Maggie found herself cornered by a group of drivers and volunteers in the dining area, now barely recognizable under a temporary tarp roof as workers patched the storm-damaged ceiling. "We are setting up a fundraising page," said a woman from Colorado, her clipboard brimming with signatures. "You will be able to expand the diner, buy new trucks for deliveries, anything you need. And we have a guy who can help redesign the parking lot," added a man from North Dakota. "Pave it properly. Put in some heating coils so it will not freeze up next winter. We can even help you franchise," another suggested, his eyes gleaming. "Diners all across the country." Imagine Turner's Maggie forced to smile, her heart pounding. They meant well, she knew that. Their enthusiasm was genuine, their generosity overwhelming in its sincerity. But the thought of turning her father's diner into a corporate enterprise, of watching it lose the soul that had made it a beacon during the storm, filled her with quiet dread. She held up her hands gently, silencing the well-meaning crowd. "I am grateful," she said, her voice firm but kind. "More grateful than I can ever express. But Turner's Diner is not about big dreams. It is about small kindnesses. It is about a hot cup of coffee on a cold morning, a meal for a trucker passing through, a place to rest when you are worn to the bone." The room quieted, the eager faces softening into understanding. "I cannot turn this place into something it was never meant to be," she continued, "but if you truly want to help, stay a while longer. Help us rebuild what was broken. Help us prepare for the next time someone needs a place to belong." For a long moment, silence stretched across the room. Then one by one, the drivers nodded. The Colorado woman tucked her clipboard under her arm and gave Maggie a thumbs up. The man from North Dakota grinned and said he would start working on clearing the parking lot instead. The man who had suggested franchising laughed and said he would be just as happy fixing the old stove. Maggie's chest loosened with relief. The gratitude remained, but now it was channeled into something she could accept without losing herself, without losing the diner's soul. The walls were patched and repainted. The battered booths were repaired, their torn vinyl covers replaced, with sturdy, weatherproof fabric donated by a trucking company specializing in heavy-duty upholstery. The kitchen received new appliances, not sleek modern replacements, but durable, reliable machines that would stand the test of time. The parking lot was cleared, not paved over, but reinforced with gravel and drainage to prevent future flooding. And the pantry was filled to the brim, stocked with enough supplies to survive another winter storm, twice as bad as the one they had just endured. Maggie moved through the diner with a sense of peace she had not felt in weeks. She accepted the help not as a burden, but as a continuation of the community they had built together. She learned to say thank you without guilt, to recognize that gratitude was not a debt to be repaid, but a bond to be honored. Late one night, after the last hammer had been set down and the final truck had rumbled off into the darkness, Maggie sat alone at the counter, cradling a mug of fresh coffee. The diner was still and warm, the repairs blending seamlessly into the familiar structure she had known all her life. She thought about everything that had happened, about the storm, the drivers, the endless convoy of kindness. She thought about how easily she could have let it all slip away in a moment of fear or pride, but she had not. She had opened her doors, and by doing so, she had opened her heart to a force greater than any blizzard. Gratitude, she realized, was not a challenge to be overcome. It was a gift, and she would carry it with her quietly and steadfastly into every morning that followed. As spring crept quietly into Montana, the last of the winter's snow finally surrendered to the thaw. The days grew longer, and the air softened, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and the distant promise of renewal. Around Turner's diner, patches of green began to emerge, timid but persistent, pushing through the once impenetrable crust of ice and snow. Inside the diner, life settled into a new rhythm. The repairs were completed, the new supplies neatly organized, and the regulars, those who had survived the storm within its walls and those who had heard about it afterward, returned to fill the booths and stools once again. Maggie Turner moved through her familiar world with a cautious sense of hope. Though the storm had passed, its impact lingered in every corner, not as a wound, but as a reminder of what could be endured and what could be built from hardship. One afternoon, as the diner bustled with the usual crowd of truckers, farmers, and townsfolk, a tall man in a clean pressed jacket entered through the glass doors. He paused just inside, letting the warmth and the smell of coffee wash over him. Maggie, wiping down the counter, looked up and immediately sensed that he was not a regular customer. He approached her with the easy confidence of someone used. Sadhu commanding attention. "Miss Turner?" he asked, extending a hand. "My name's Walter Briggs. I own Briggs Freight Lines. We run routes across Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas." Maggie shook his hand, wary but polite. She had grown used to strangers arriving with grand ideas after the storm, many of which she had gently declined. "I have heard a lot about what you did here," Briggs continued. "You kept our people alive when the world outside forgot about them. That means something to me. To all of us." Maggie nodded, waiting. "I am not here to buy your diner," he said. Quickly, sensing her guardedness. "You a partnership?" "I am here to offer." At that, Maggie blinked, caught off guard. Briggs pulled a folder from under his arm and laid it on the counter. Inside were maps, contracts, proposals, all centered around Turner's diner. Not to franchise it, not to turn it into a brand, but to make it an official stop on the freight lines. His company, and others he represented, wanted to establish Turner's as a recognized safe haven for truckers. A place where drivers could always find a hot meal, a warm bed, and a helping hand, no matter the season. "You would still own the diner," Briggs said. "You would run it the way you always have. We just want to make sure you have the support you need. Supplies, maintenance, even emergency backup for storms like the one you just survived." Maggie turned the idea over in her mind, feeling its weight. It was not the offer of expansion or commercialization that she had feared. It was a reinforcement of everything she had fought to preserve: the diner's spirit of service, its place in the community, its role as a lifeline. Still, it was a monumental decision. Accepting meant committing to a future tied to the road and the people who traveled it. It meant acknowledging that Turner's Diner had outgrown its role as just a small-town eatery. It had become something larger, something essential. Briggs must have seen the hesitation on her face because he smiled and added, "Have to decide. Today. But know this, what you built here matters, and it deserves to be protected." "You do not." He left the folder on the counter and tipped his hat before stepping back out into the bright afternoon light. Maggie sat down heavily on one of the stools, staring at the folder. She thought about the endless line of trucks, the drivers who had dug through snow to keep the diner warm, the volunteers who had patched the walls and stocked the shelves. She thought about the laughter that had filled the diner in the nights after the storm, the sense of community that had been born in the darkest of hours. She realized that Turner's had never really been hers alone. It belonged to everyone who had found shelter within its walls, everyone who had kept its spirit alive when it could have so easily been lost. In the days that followed, Maggie considered the offer carefully. She spoke with Juan and Tessa, who had stood by her through the worst of it. She spoke with Joe Randall, who had practically made the diner his second home since the storm. She even spoke with some of the old-timers who remembered her father and the original spirit of Turner's Diner. Every conversation brought her closer to the same conclusion. It was not about changing what Turner's was. A week later, Maggie called Walter Briggs and accepted the partnership. The transition was smooth and respectful. Supplies began to arrive regularly. A backup generator was installed, new bedding, and emergency equipment was stocked in case another storm ever trapped them again. Training sessions were held, not just for Maggie's staff but for the truckers themselves, creating a network of support that stretched far beyond the town's borders. Turner's Diner officially became a recognized safe stop on several major freight routes. A discreet plaque was mounted near the entrance, "In gratitude for the winter of the great storm, a place where no one is left behind." Maggie stood beside it one morning, watching the sunrise spill golden light across the snow-melted fields. She thought of her father, of everything he had taught her about kindness and service and stubborn hope. Turner's had survived the storm, and now it would endure every storm to come, its foundation strengthened not by wood and nails alone, but by the indomitable spirit of all those who had chosen compassion over comfort. It was no longer just a diner. It was a testament, a promise, and Maggie Turner would guard it with all her heart. Summer descended on Montana with a force that seemed determined to erase every memory of the brutal winter. The fields around Turner's Diner transformed from icy white plains into seas of green and gold, dotted with wildflowers that swayed in the warm breeze. The once impassable roads buzzed again, with the familiar rhythm of trucks and cars passing through, their tires humming over sun-warmed asphalt. Within the walls of Turner's Diner, change was everywhere, yet nothing important had been lost. The repairs and improvements made after the storm had blended seamlessly with the diner's original charm. The cracked linoleum floors had been replaced with sturdy, rustic hardwood. The booths had been reupholstered in warm earth tones, inviting and timeless. The walls were repainted but retained their history, their old photographs and memorabilia lovingly restored and reframed. Above the entrance, a new sign had been hung, simple but profound, capturing the spirit that had sustained them through the darkest days. Turner's Diner, here no one is left behind. The first time Maggie Turner stepped back and looked at the finished space, she felt a lump rise in her throat. It was still her father's diner, still the place where she had spent her childhood bussing tables and learning the value of hard work. But it had also become something more, a living monument to the resilience and compassion of a community that had refused to be beaten by the storm. Business thrived in a way it never had before. Truckers, tourists, and locals alike flocked to Turner's, drawn not just by the hearty meals, but by the story that now lived in its walls. Word of what had happened during the storm had spread far beyond Montana's borders. Travel bloggers, news outlets, and trucking magazines had written about the diner that had stood like a lighthouse in the blizzard, offering refuge when the world outside had frozen over. Maggie could not walk from the kitchen to the counter without someone stopping her for a handshake. a thank you or a story about where they had heard of Turner's Diner. It was humbling, sometimes overwhelming, but she accepted it with quiet grace. She knew now that the diner was no longer just a place to eat. It was a symbol, and symbols had a way of outliving the people who created them. Juan and Tessa, her steadfast companions through the storm, had stayed on without hesitation. Juan managed the kitchen with an efficiency that kept the endless flow of customers fed and satisfied, his hands moving over the grill and stove with the ease of a master craftsman. Tessa ran the front of the house, her easy smile and quick wit turning first-time visitors into loyal regulars. Maggie spent her days moving between both worlds, filling whatever role was needed. She poured coffee, flipped pancakes, fixed the occasional leaky sink, and listened to the stories of those who passed through. Every day brought new faces and new tales, and Maggie gathered them all like precious stones, weaving them into the ongoing story of Turner's Diner. But it was not just business that had changed. The partnership with Briggs Freight Lines and other trucking companies had blossomed into a network of support that extended far beyond the walls of the diner. Drivers knew that if they broke down near Turner's, they could count on help. Families traveling cross-country knew that if they needed a safe place to stop, Turner's would welcome them without question. Emergency supplies were stocked year-round, now not just for the diner but for anyone in need. Blankets, non-perishable food, medical kits, all kept ready, all part of the commitment that had grown from one simple decision during a blizzard to open the door and let people in. The local town embraced the new Turners as well. Community events were held there regularly, fundraisers, food drives, holiday dinners. The diner became a hub for more than just meals. It became the beating heart of a town that had found a renewed sense of pride and purpose in its survival story. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, Maggie found herself sitting on the front porch, watching the last of the day's trucks roll by. A soft breeze stirred the newly hung wind chimes, above the door their song gentle and familiar. Joe Randall, who had never really left after the storm, sat beside her, a steaming mug of coffee cradled in his hands. "You built something special here," he said, breaking the comfortable silence. Maggie shook her head lightly. "We built it," she corrected. Joe smiled, looking out over the parking lot where a dozen rigs gleamed in the twilight. "Maybe," he said, "but you were the one who opened the door." They sat together as the stars began to emerge one by one, filling the sky with quiet brilliance. In the distance, the faint hum of the highway rose and fell like the breath of a living world, constant and enduring. Maggie thought about all the choices that had led to this moment. The choice to stay when others might have fled. The choice to give when there was almost nothing left. The choice to believe that even in the worst of storms, kindness could endure. Turner's Diner had been reborn not through grand gestures or sweeping changes, but through thousands of small acts of courage and compassion, each one as vital as the next. It was not flashy. It was not famous in the ways that mattered to the wider world. But it was strong and it was true, and it would stand, Maggie vowed, for as long as she had breath to give it life. The storm had tested them, broken them down to their rawest selves. But from that brokenness had emerged something far stronger than any storm could tear apart. Turner's Diner was not just surviving, it was thriving. And the spirit of that winter's kindness would live on in every cup of coffee poured, every meal served, and every door opened to a weary traveler searching for a place to call home. Autumn came to Montana like a slow-burning ember, setting, the hills ablaze with fiery hues of gold, orange, and crimson. The chill in the morning air was sharp, but not yet biting, a reminder that another winter would soon arrive, but also a call to savor the brief, beautiful interlude between seasons. For Maggie Turner and the community that had grown around Turner's Diner, this autumn was not like any that had come before. This year marked the beginning of something new, something born not from strategy or planning, but from the raw, unyielding spirit of that unforgettable storm. The first signs of the new tradition appeared early. A trickle of trucks began arriving. In the days leading up to the anniversary of the blizzard, their tires crackling on the gravel lot that had been fortified after the winter's thaw. Drivers Maggie had not seen in months, some she had thought long gone, pulled into the lot one by one, old rigs and new ones, gleaming cabs and battered workhorses alike, all bearing the same quiet, determined purpose. At first, Maggie thought it a coincidence. She stood on the porch, arms folded, watching as familiar faces climbed down from their trucks, brushing dust from their jeans, stretching limbs stiff from long hours on the road. They smiled at her, not with the urgency of those who needed shelter, but with the warmth of old friends returning home. By the third day, the trickle had become a flood, the lot filled with trucks of every size and color, forming neat rows that stretched farther than Maggie could see. Men and women gathered in the diner and around makeshift fire pits in the cool evening air, sharing meals, swapping stories, laughing with the easy camaraderie that only those who had faced the worst together could understand. It was Joe Randall who put words to what was happening as he leaned against the counter one morning sipping his coffee. "You started something that night, Maggie," he said, "and it ain't something that just ends because the snow melted. Folks needed a way to remember, to come back and say it still matters." The realization hit her with the same weight as the first snow of winter. This was not just a gathering, it was a pilgrimage, a living memorial to the choices made during the storm, to the kindness that had saved lives and restored faith in a world that so often forgot the power of small, selfless acts. Maggie embraced it without hesitation. Preparations were made quickly but with heart. Long tables were set up both inside and outside the diner, covered in checkered cloths and loaded with food. Local farmers donated fresh produce. Bakers brought loaves of bread and pies still warm from the oven. Musicians tuned their guitars and banjos, filling the air with music that drifted sweet and low through the crisp autumn evenings. A banner was hung across the front of the diner, hand-painted and simple. First annual Turner's Gathering, no one left behind. The celebration was not flashy or grandiose, it was real, built on the same foundation that had carried them through the storm: generosity, resilience, and the quiet strength of a community that refused to let the memory of that shared ordeal fade into silence. Throughout the weekend, old friends reunited, strangers became family, and the stories of that terrible winter were retold, each time slightly embellished, but always ending with the same truth, that in their darkest hour, they had found light in one another. Children who had been only infants during the storm toddled through the crowd, their laughter high and bright. Teens who had grown up hearing tales of the blizzard and the diner ran errands, served food, and listened wide-eyed as the veterans of that winter spoke of the days when the world outside had turned to ice and the inside of Turner's had burned with stubborn hope. On the final night, under a sky thick with stars, the entire gathering moved outside. A great fire was lit at the center of the lot, and everyone circled around it, the flames casting long, flickering shadows on the ground. Maggie stood near the fire, the silver coin Hank had given her tucked securely in her pocket, a talisman that had come to symbolize all they had endured and all they had built. There were no speeches, no grand declarations, just the soft murmur of voices, the crackle of the fire, and the unspoken agreement among them all that this was not the end of something, but the continuation of it. Joe passed around a battered, old radio, the same one he had used to send out calls during the storm. One by one, people spoke into it, sending messages of gratitude, remembrance, and hope out into the night, into the invisible airwaves that had once connected them when all else had failed. Maggie listened, her heart swelling with each voice, each story, each promise to return the next year and the next and the next. When it was her turn, she held the microphone in hands that trembled only slightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the lot, "for trusting Turners, for trusting each other. This place was never just a diner. It was always meant to be a home." She lowered the microphone, and for a moment there was only silence, deep and profound. Then the fire blazed higher, and a chorus of voices rose together, a spontaneous, joyful noise that filled the cold night air and echoed into the hills beyond. Turner's Diner had weathered the storm of the century. Every year, as autumn leaves began to fall and the first chill crept into the air, the trucks would return, the people would gather, and Turner's would open its doors wide, a living reminder that in the darkest storms, it is not the walls that protect us, but the hearts within them. Turner's Diner was no longer just a place on the map. It was a promise kept. It was a legacy, made not of steel or stone, but of compassion, resilience, and the quiet, unbreakable conviction that no one ever would be left behind. As the embers of the fire drifted into the star-laden sky, Maggie Turner stood among her people, her family, and knew with a certainty deeper than the winter snows and stronger than the fiercest winds that they had created something that would endure for generations, a tradition born of a storm, a future built on hope, a home that would never close its doors, not ever.